Welcome to a new episode of our podcast. I am especially pleased to have Ian Hutchinson with us today. Ian is a professor of nuclear science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is not only one of the most prestigious universities in the world, but has also held the top spot among universities worldwide for many years. Ian, our pleasure in welcoming you to the podcast is all the greater. Before we get into the content, we'd like to hear who you are. And as always, once again, Hannah will take care of that today.
Thank you. Ian, you are a professor of nuclear science and engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is a very famous university. It was voted for the world best university in the last year. You are an international expert on the physics of plasmas. You and your team designed, built, and operated on the fusion research experiment. You were formerly the head of MIT's Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering. You are the editor-in-chief of the leading journal Plasma Physics and Controlled Fusion. And 2008, you were the chairman of the division of plasma physics in the American Physical Society. You are a fellow of the American Physical Society and the Institute of Physics. In addition to authoring over 200 scientific journals, articles, and 2 advanced science books, you also have written and spoken widely on the relationship between science and Christianity. Your latest book, Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? An MIT Professor Answers Questions on God and Science, addresses a wide range of the tough questions you have been asked over decades in explaining science and Christianity to university audiences.
Thank you, Hannah. That was an impressive resume. Ian, as a professor of nuclear sciences, you work at MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Can you describe to us what exactly you do there?
So strictly speaking, I'm a physicist. My department is the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering, and I am a physicist interested in a particular branch of physics called plasma physics. Now, plasma is actually the 4th state of matter. So we think about matter as being solid, liquid, and gas. And actually, though, there is a state of matter beyond gas, which is still gaseous, but it's a state in which the electrons and the nuclei are separated, they're ionized, and because they're then dealing with charged particles, those charged particles make up the particles of a plasma. And those charged particles are affected by electric and magnetic fields, and they also affect the electric and magnetic fields. There's a two-way conversation between those two things. So I'm a plasma physicist, but the reason perhaps that my appointment is in the engineering school at MIT is that one of the main applications of plasma physics is the attempt to bring the energy source of the sun and stars down to the human scale and make it available as a new form of nuclear energy. The form of nuclear energy that we currently have is called fission. That takes takes heavy elements like uranium and breaks them up and gets energy out. Fusion takes light elements like hydrogen and very nuclei with very small number of particles in the nucleus and merges them together. That's what fusion means. It creates heavier elements. And this also, it turns out, releases energy. And fusion reactions are the energy source that causes the sun to shine and all the other stars to shine. And the question is, can we bring such a cosmic energy source down to the human scale? It would be, if successful, it would be non-emitting of carbon dioxide or other pollutions. So it would be much more attractive than fossil fuels from the point of view of the environment. And that's one of the things that I worked on during most of my career is, can we make fusion energy work?
And this project is already successful today, or is there still a long way to go?
So in order to get a self-sustained fusion reaction to burn, we have to confine this very hot plasma. The plasma in a fusion reactor would have a temperature that's something like 100 million degrees Celsius. So it would be actually slightly hotter than the center of the sun. And because of that incredibly high temperature, we couldn't put that plasma inside of some solid or material bottle. We have to control it and prevent the heat from leaking out from it using immaterial forces. The way this is done in nature, in a star, is by gravity. So gravity holds a star together and holds it together long enough so that the fusion reactions can make it hot and make a self-sustaining fusion reactor. Amazingly stable for billions of years, okay? On Earth, gravity isn't strong enough because in small bodies, gravity is a rather weak effect. And so we need to use stronger forces, and the forces that we attempt to use, in most of my research, are magnetic fields. So we hold this plasma using magnetic fields, and we heat it up, and we study how successful we've been in creating a magnetic bottle, a device that holds in the plasma. And so far, in the worldwide effort to generate controlled fusion reactions, we have generated up to some megawatts of fusion reactions at a time in a magnetically confined plasma, but not to the point where the plasma is keeping itself hot by its own reactions. So, simple analogy is if you have a match where you're trying to light a fire, if you hold the match up to the sticks or the wooden things you're trying to burn, maybe smoke comes away from it, and therefore the sticks are burning. But if you take the match away, maybe the sticks keep burning, or maybe they just fizzle out because you removed the heat source that you were putting into the fire. And if the fire keeps burning, we say that it has ignited. That's the English expression that we use, ignited. And so we haven't produced in magnetic fusion device an ignited plasma, but we have produced a plasma where there are a significant number of fusion reactions burning. And there are currently under construction 2 experiments worldwide, one in the south of France called ITER, and one that's actually in Massachusetts called Spark, that are planned to reach a truly burning state where it's either ignited or so close to ignited that it doesn't really matter. And those experiments will operate probably in the next 10 or 20 years. And so this is a long-term scientific development project. And what we've demonstrated so far is that we understand what is required to make magnetic fusion work, but we haven't actually demonstrated it, in fact.
So would you say that it is right that the difficulties we have today are more technical than physical?
Yeah, they're technical, they're scientific, but I think we understand the science, and these experiments that we have under construction are taking the science we know. We don't know all the science, but we know enough science to propose to build these devices. And so, yes, there's engineering that needs to be done, construction, and so forth. Mind you, those 2 experiments that I just mentioned are experiments. They won't be putting electricity on the grid or, actually selling energy to, consumers. They're a scientific demonstration. And beyond that, a great deal of engineering, design and development and solution of technical problems will have to be done. And that's why people often ask me, well, when are we going to have fusion energy on the grid? And my answer is not in my lifetime. And that remains my answer.
Yeah. I understand. Ian, I have one more question at this point. MIT is considered one of the best universities in the world, where only the brightest minds can be found. You are a professor of nuclear sciences, but that's just your profession, your identity, your worldview is. You see yourself as a convinced Bible-believing Christian. Some might then wonder, how can an MIT professor be a Christian? Aren't you too rational for that?
Well, I think it's a fallacy that Christianity and science are incompatible. And it's certainly the case that MIT has lots of people here that are serious believers, Christian believers, including on the faculty. Actually, the myth that science and Christianity are at war, which is, I think, still a widespread myth today, was initially put forward in the 19th century, at least in the English-speaking world, as part of a move to secularize the academy. And prior to that time, no one would really have thought in those terms. I mean, historically, science had, in a certain sense, been a Christian enterprise. Certainly, the academy had very much been a Christian enterprise, and most of the universities prior to the 19th century started life as Christian foundations. What's more, the people who founded the scientific revolution, people like Newton and Galileo and so forth, these people were predominantly Christian believers, and they didn't see any great contradiction between being a serious Christian and being a scientist, being interested to understand the world on its own terms and pursue a very systematic understanding of nature. And that's what natural science is. It's basically trying to understand nature on its own terms, or it's explaining nature naturally, is the way I put it, at least in English. So I think it's very much the case that Christians are just as able to think carefully, critically, rationally about their faith and about the natural world as anybody else. And so I simply don't accept the implied premise that somehow religion is irrational and what we ought to be doing in universities is based on rationality. I think, on the contrary, that the Christian faith is rational. It's not rationalistic. It depends on a lot of things beyond science, but science is not all of rationality.
Has there actually been a change here? The thought that Christians, in particular, have a high interest in science because it is an ideal way to understand how God has arranged the universe and our world. Not many people think that way anymore. Today, most people believe that faith and science are contradictory. Do you have any idea how this change came about?
I wouldn't say that Christians necessarily do science because of their beliefs. I think they are perfectly capable of doing science regardless of their beliefs. And I certainly think that these days, perhaps, during the 20th and 21st centuries, we reached the point where science was so successful that all of humanity became inspired to say, this is really worth doing, and let's get on with it. And so, of course, not all scientists these days are Christians by a long shot. There are plenty of people who are anti-Christian in science as well as Christians. But historically, nevertheless, it was the case that the vast majority of the early scientists were Christians. And so I would argue that to take the view that somehow there's this historical and inevitable controversy or warfare between science and the Christian faith, it simply isn't historically true. And so one shouldn't assume that. Of course, you're right. Many people do assume that. I would say one reason is that the intellectual status of science these days is regarded as being much higher than the intellectual status, let's say, of theology or of other intellectual disciplines associated directly with Christianity. maybe that's justified. Certainly science is very successful, and perhaps that's the reason. But I don't think that there's an inherent contradiction between science and faith.
And you mentioned that that you are not alone at MIT as a convinced Christian. Would you like to give us an insight into who else sees themselves as followers of Jesus? And are there actually places at your university where topics like God and faith are discussed?
Yeah. Certainly, there are lots of Christians at MIT. There are many student Christian groups at MIT. Many of those I've spoken to and interacted with. Just to illustrate the importance of Christians, or the significance, let's say, of Christians at a place like MIT, actually, Christians are quite strongly represented in academic service and leadership. So when I became the department head of my department at MIT, because of that responsibility, I became part of the engineering council at MIT, which was all the heads of the engineering departments at MIT, of which there were a total of 9. And when I first went to that meeting of those department heads, I knew that I was actually one of 3 Christians in that group, because I had prayed with the other 2. So actually, remarkably, 1/3 of the department heads at MIT at that time were Christians. So that gives you a flavor, at any rate, of the importance of people of faith within a place like MIT. Later on, the president of MIT was a Christian believer and routinely attended church in Boston on Sundays. And among the faculty, there is a group of active Christians that numbers about 25, which isn't a large fraction of the professors at MIT. There are 1,000 professors at MIT. But nevertheless, members of that group attend meetings from time to time to share our faith and our ideas, and to pray for one another and for the Institute. And quite a few of the faculty at MIT are actually active in what is called the Veritas Forum, which is an organization that's sprang out of work at Harvard and MIT and elsewhere, and has become a very important university organization that organizes talks about Christianity and the intellectual life. So, bottom line, I don't know the exact statistics. No one knows exactly how many Christians there are on the faculty at MIT, but they're well represented.
I would like to delve into your experiences in conversation with faith-skeptical people. You have had public debates and dialogues with many well-known atheists. The astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss was just one of them. In your opinion, what were the best arguments you heard in your conversations? And what was your response? And a second question right after. Your motive for engaging in these dialogues is clear. You want to show that the Christian faith is rationally defensible. What do you think the motives of your atheist conversation partners were? Did you perhaps learn some things backstage that were not admitted on stage?
Well, first of all, just to elaborate a little bit, the overlap between the last 2 questions, I've had many opportunities to share my ideas about the relationship between science and Christianity at lots of university venues through the Veritas Forum, literally many dozens of such talks. And I also give talks to other organizations. I've given talks to churches and high schools and things like that. So that has, for me, been one of the opportunities that I've enjoyed and benefited from to share my faith. You asked about debates. Well, yeah, I have done debates in the form of sort of gladiatorial battles, intellectual battles. They are great entertainment, and so they're enjoyable, I think, for the audience. But they're generally, I think, less good at the opportunities for taking seriously the ideas of one's opponents. So in general, what we have done in the Veritas Forum has not been debates per se. It's been much more what we call dialogues. an attempt to have a respectful discussion between a Christian believer such as myself and very often an unbeliever from the faculty, let's say, of a different university to which I would go and be part of a Veritas forum. And I have found those types of interactions to be, I think, more helpful to think through one's understanding of the other's position and to think through the questions that I think engage almost all of us, about life, the universe, and everything. As far as the arguments of the new atheists, people like Michael Shermer and Lawrence Krauss, they are mostly, in my view, rather poorly thought out in terms of their philosophy. They tend, in a certain sense, to be more appeals to slogans or to emotion than to logical consideration. So, for example, Lawrence Krauss is well known for having written a book called A Universe from Nothing. And so one of his arguments is to invoke the possibility that the universe arose from a quantum fluctuation, as if that's an argument against one of the classical philosophical arguments for there being a creator, that where did the world come from? But actually, I find that whole argument rather unsatisfactory, intellectually silly, actually, on its face. Because the truth of the matter is, it might be the case that the universe arose from a quantum fluctuation, but that's not a universe from nothing, as his book title says. It's actually a universe from the laws of physics. And where did those laws come from? Well, physics doesn't answer that. So one can therefore move on to the next question. Well, where did the laws of physics come from? So there's a sense in which this is a philosophically unsatisfactory argument against religious faith or against the classic arguments for the deity. And so that's my viewpoint on the arguments against the faith. But as I say, I far prefer respectful dialogues, and I want to be a seeker for truth. And when people come who are seekers for truth, an event like a Veritas Forum helps people explore why they hold the views that they do, to ask hard questions about faith or about non-faith without ridiculing other people's ideas. And actually, my book, which is called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles?, is actually based on the questions that I've been asked at Veritas forums. So I have more than 200 questions that I've been asked at Veritas forums. So these are real questions. I didn't change the questions. And I try to engage with those questions seriously and give what I consider to be serious answers to hard questions. And I find that enormously interesting to me, and I think it's interesting to the listeners too.
I think it was John Lennox from Oxford University who spoke similarly about the way one should engage with faith-skeptical people and how not to. Thank you for emphasizing, once again, that dialogue always precedes debate. But honestly, was there ever a question in your dialogues where you thought, oh boy, this question is really good. I need to think about this longer?
Well, I certainly don't have answers to all the questions that people can ask, and I would never claim to. I think that there are hard questions to which we, as Christian believers, don't have all the answers to. I think one of those hard questions is about, if there is a God who is all-powerful and all-loving, how come there seems to be so much suffering in the world? I think that's a question that religious believers have wrestled with for millennia, and to which there are, I think, actually some fairly good Christian theological answers. I won't give them right now, but I think there are also such emotional demands in that question and such a reality to the suffering that people feel in their lives that there is, in a certain sense, no answer that is going to alleviate the suffering of any given person who is perhaps undergoing suffering and asking themselves that question. So that's an example of a hard question, which I would say, I think there are some theological answers that I find satisfactory, But I don't think that in a certain sense I can answer the deeper question, which is, the existential question that a person feels when they're asking that question. But I must say that I think the questions that I ask and answer in my book are a very good representation of the sorts of questions that young people, particularly young people in universities, ask themselves today.
Let's imagine someone asks you, Ian, as a professor at MIT, you must be aware of the great value of science and reason, but isn't it most reasonable to adopt the worldview of naturalism as long as there is no scientific evidence for the existence of God? After all, naturalism makes the fewest assumptions about the state of the world.
Well, I would first of all dispute the idea that the secular or materialist worldview makes the fewest claims. I think that it makes lots of claims. One claim that it often makes is that one should only believe things that are scientifically demonstrable. And that's a viewpoint, an outlook, which is often called scientism. And it's actually a totally inadequate understanding of how human knowledge actually works. But I think maybe what you're getting at is an invocation of what is often called Occam's razor. At least in English, it's called Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the idea that we should generally seek explanations that are the simplest ones, sufficient to explain all the facts. And we shouldn't add other elaborations that are unnecessary. And I take the view that there are facts of history, of human personality, of society, of minds, of many different things, as well as science, and that a materialistic view doesn't explain those types of other things besides science. And belief in God, indeed, nevertheless, beyond that, belief in Jesus as God's incarnation isn't explained by that. That belief comes from a consideration of all of these things, of all of these different facts of the world around us. And so actually, I think understanding and explaining those facts which go beyond merely scientific facts is a vital part of the challenge to us as humans. And I think that those cannot really be explained without delving into spiritual questions. And we should do it not in the manner of scientific explanation, but we should do it in a way that is consistent with what we know about the world scientifically. And so I think what's left when you apply Occam's razor to life is a mistake, because life is more than just what goes on in science. And that there is a sense in which the Christian view of the world is an attempt to construct and understand the universe and our lives and all these other aspects of the world in a way which is complete.
Would you agree with the idea proposed by many renowned Christian philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, and others who say that God is a simple being, not a complex one, precisely because he is pure spirit? Would you agree with this idea?
I don't think we know what we're talking about when we talk in those terms, simplicity. And of course, the people you just mentioned are usually contradicting arguments of Richard Dawkins and others who say, well, that somehow God is a very complicated thing that is invoked to explain things, and that therefore he is in violation, if you like, of Occam's razor. I mean, I agree with Swinburne and people you mentioned that you could make an argument that God is simple. At least I would say the essence of God might be considered to be simple. If you think of God as being the first cause, a necessary being, and so forth, you could argue that those ideas are in a certain sense simple. But I don't think God is lacking in complexity. So really, this is very much a technical philosophical argument, and I prefer to think of it in a rather broader perspective. And that's why I gave you this answer that has to do with trying to understand what we mean by Occam's razor. Occam's razor is having enough complexity to your argument to explain the things you're trying to explain. And if all you're trying to explain is the science that we know about the world, maybe you don't need God for that. But actually, we need much more than that to explain the totality of our world. And I think that Christian theology is aimed at giving that kind of in-depth explanation.
Thank you. I think an even more common question many people have is that they say, I am not convinced by Christian arguments for two reasons. First, they rely heavily on our current ignorance. For example, the origin of the universe, consciousness, genetic information. Since science has solved many mysteries so far, it is likely that we will clarify these questions in the future. Then the arguments for God will collapse. That's why these arguments don't convince me. Ian, how would you respond to this objection?
Okay, I would start by saying, actually, no, Christianity is not based on what we don't know, which is one of the presumptions behind this question. It was not based on what they didn't know. For the first disciples, they knew Jesus and they were witnesses to his resurrection, and that's why they went out and spread their message to the world. And speaking personally, I find the person, the teaching, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus persuasive and inspiring. So I would argue that that's based on things that I know. Then we can look, for example, at the enormous influence of the Christian faith over the centuries and recognize that the Christian faith was the womb and cradle of our entire Western civilization, including science. So that's another aspect of what we know. And Christians like me say we actually know Jesus through a personal spiritual connection. So really, there's public knowledge and there's personal knowledge of things that go to make up the Christian faith. Now, science has been tremendously successful at understanding the universe insofar as the universe behaves reproducibly. And I expect that understanding to continue to grow. Physics, chemistry, biology, these are all based on the essence of repeatable experiments. But I see no prospect that science will end up explaining away, for example, conscious minds. Because if it did, there wouldn't be any reason to believe the ideas that our minds contain, including science. So we have to, if we're going to be logically consistent, concede that our minds contain more than just interacting neurons, because otherwise we're going to be self-contradictory. Now, I don't know how far neuroscience, for example, will be able to go in understanding our brains. We're making progress. It's hard science, and many of my colleagues at MIT are studying this. But however far it does go, and I expect it'll go a long way, but it'll take a long time, I'm confident that ideas in the mind will not disappear. The brain does not have ideas. The mind has ideas, okay? And so I think the idea that somehow science will explain away in terms of elementary particles and the laws of physics, everything in our world, I don't think that is going to happen, and I think it is inconsistent to suppose that it will. And therefore, I don't feel that my Christian faith is threatened by actual scientific progress. What's more, your supposed questioner is in a certain sense taking credit for hypothetical progress. So I don't think that current science threatens my faith, but I also don't think that future or hypothetical science progress is going to threaten it. I mean, I might be wrong, but I think there's good reasons, such as the one that I just gave, to suppose that it won't actually be threatened in that way.
Another objection is where knowledge ends, God begins. But however, the most honest answer is that where verifiable knowledge ends, ignorance begins. We may never know the origin of the universe or genetic information. What would you say to that?
Yes, again, this is presuming that faith is the opposite of knowledge, which is another facet of this, what I regard as a kind of false contrast. It isn't true that faith is the opposite of knowledge. Faith doesn't depend on ignorance, which is what your questioner really is saying. Whether we're people of faith or not, we certainly ought to have a degree of humility that admits that there's a lot we do not know and perhaps never will know. But my experience, actually, of Christians is that, on average, they tend to have that humility in substantially greater measure than the anti-theists. They tend to be, let's say, more arrogantly assertive of their own ideas. What's more, faith doesn't mean blindly holding beliefs without evidence or even against the evidence. That isn't, in my view, what faith means. In fact, faith is not just belief in propositions. Faith has different aspects to it. I don't know whether this is so true in German, but in English, at any rate, faith can mean belief in propositions, but it also means trusting what you do know, even though that knowledge is incomplete. So it could, for example, mean that if I get on board an airplane to fly to Germany, I am trusting, I have faith in the reliability of that airplane. So that's a kind of faith. And there's also a third meaning to the word faith in English, which is that it means acting with loyalty towards the people and principles that your life depends on. So, when I act in faith towards my wife, for example, it means that I act in a way that is consistent with my loyalty to her, the fact that we are committed to one another in the bonds of our marriage. When I act in faith, that's acting out that loyalty. So the Christian faith embodies all three of those meanings: belief and trust and loyalty. And actually, in many respects, the Christian faith is more about trust and loyalty than it is about belief in propositions, in my view. But that would take too long to unpack, so I'll leave it at that.
Ian, you mentioned it. You trust Jesus. What does that mean to you?
Well, so what does it mean? Very briefly, what my Christian faith brought into my life was a person. I became a Christian when I was a student at Cambridge. In doing so, I became intellectually convinced, if you like. I came to a belief in Jesus as a historic figure, as the things that he claimed to be. But I also came to faith commitment in the sense of loyalty that I was just discussing, trust and loyalty, a faith commitment to the risen Christ as Lord of my life. And I had actually struggled with that second part of what I understood to be the Christian call, not just to, belief that Jesus was who he said he was, but also a willingness to make him Lord of my life. I had struggled with that because, like most young adults, I thought I wanted to be the Lord of my own life. But I discovered, and this had been suggested to me that it would happen, but it's still paradoxical, I think, that I discovered that yielding my life to Christ as Lord was tremendously liberating. It gave me a whole new and broader perspective and helped me look out beyond my own, selfish preoccupations. I now knew that, or I trusted that God loves the world and that God calls me to love it, and especially to love other people too. Jesus said that he came that we might have life in abundance, abundant life. And that is what I found in Jesus. Incidentally, though, since science is done by people and much of scientific leadership, for example, involves human relationships, actually being a Christian has also helped me to be a better scientist as well as a better person. So That's how I would summarize it.
That was really great. Thank you very much, Ian. We really appreciate your insights and for sharing a bit of the fascinating world of MIT with us. It has truly been a joy and an honor to have you on our podcast. We hope that our listeners found some valuable takeaways from this episode as well. As always, we're very eager to hear your thoughts on this episode. Please feel free to share your feedback and let us know how you enjoyed the interview. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Goodbye.